The shouting started just after midnight. Guards were pounding down the hall, flashlights flickering off cold concrete walls. Somewhere inside Rikers Island, a fight had broken out in the intake block, a place already packed with new inmates waiting to be processed. Through the narrow windows, you could see the blue-red glow of patrol lights bouncing off razor wire. Inside, chaos echoed. A young inmate named Tyler King pressed his face against the bars, trying to see what was happening. He could hear fists hitting flesh, the thud of boots, the sharp crack of a baton. "Somebody get help," a voice screamed. But the guards didn't rush in right away, they waited. That's what shocked Tyler the most. It wasn't the fight. It was how long it took anyone to care. Minutes passed before the shouting faded and 2 inmates were dragged out, one bleeding, one unconscious. Tyler stepped back, heart racing. He'd been locked up before, but this wasn't like any jail he'd seen. Later, when they wheeled one of the men past his cell, Tyler overheard a guard say quietly, "He's not gonna make it." That night, Tyler made himself a promise. If he ever got out of Rikers, he was going to tell the world what really went on inside. And he would start by comparing it to every other jail he'd been in, because none of them came close to this. The next morning, the block was silent except for the hum of fluorescent lights. Breakfast was 2 slices of bread and something gray that was supposed to be oatmeal. Tyler sat with his tray, staring at the wall. Across from him, an older inmate named Lewis chuckled bitterly. "First time here?" he asked. Tyler nodded. Lewis leaned in. "You think this place is bad now? Try county jail in Chicago. Or Cook County. At least they feed you warm food there. Here, it's just survival." Tyler listened. He'd been in county jails before, Ray County, Fulton, even a few days in Baltimore, but none had the smell Rikers had, sweat, bleach, and fear mixed into the air. "Why do they let it get this bad?" Tyler asked quietly. Lewis shook his head. "Because it's Rikers, kid. People forget about you the second that gate closes." Later that week, during recreation hour, Tyler met a man named Jameson who'd been transferred from a jail in Texas. "Down in Houston," Jameson said, "we had air conditioning, man. You're lucky if the fans even work." He laughed, but his eyes didn't match the sound. "This place eats you alive." As days passed, Tyler began to notice the differences between Rikers and other jails he'd known. At LA County, inmates complained about overcrowding, but at Rikers, you could barely breathe. The cells built for 1 now held 3. In some blocks, mattresses were laid on the floor. At night, the light stayed on, bright enough to keep anyone from real sleep. Then there were the guards. Some were decent, others cruel. One officer, a tall woman named Grant, seemed to enjoy taunting the inmates. "You boys think you got it rough?" she'd say, smirking. "Try doing my shift." She laughed like it was all a joke. But the joke ended one afternoon. Tyler was mopping the floor when 2 guards came running past him. A voice shouted, "Lockdown! Lockdown!" Doors slammed. Alarms blared. The air filled with the metallic rattle of panic. Tyler dropped the mop and pressed his ear to the cell bars. He heard it before he saw it, screaming, the sound of something breaking, a scuffle. When the guards finally dragged the source of the commotion past, Tyler froze. It was Lewis, the same man who'd told him about Chicago jail, his face swollen, blood running from his mouth. Behind him, 2 other inmates shouted that the guards had done it. For the first time, Tyler felt true fear. He realized the biggest difference between Rikers and every other U.S. jail wasn't the food, or the heat, or the crowding. It was control. Here, nobody had any. Not the inmates. Not even the guards. As the sirens faded and the block went silent again, Tyler sat down slowly on his bunk. The smell of bleach burned his nose. He whispered to himself, "If this is Rikers, what are the other places really like?" Outside, the floodlights glowed over razor wire as the city of New York glittered just across the water, so close, yet impossibly far. Inside, Tyler stared at the ceiling, wondering if Lewis would live through the night. And then, somewhere down the corridor, another voice began to scream. By sunrise, the screams had stopped, but the silence that followed felt worse. The guards walked the tier without saying a word, their boots echoing through the cell block like gunshots. Tyler barely slept. Every time he closed his eyes, he saw Lewis's face, bloody, swollen, and lifeless. The next day, a rumor spread fast. Lewis had died in the infirmary. Some said it was from his injuries, others said it was because no one treated him in time. Either way, nobody believed it was an accident. Tyler sat on the edge of his bunk, staring at the gray floor. "They killed him," Jameson whispered through the bars. "They'll call it a heart attack, but we all know what really happened." Tyler didn't answer. He knew talking could get him in trouble. At Rikers, words traveled faster than wind. Still, something inside him burned. He thought about all the jails he'd seen, places that were bad, yes, but never like this. In Baltimore, the guards shouted but didn't strike. In Chicago, fights broke out, but the medical staff actually showed up. Here, everything felt forgotten, abandoned. Later that afternoon, the unit was called out for inspection. Everyone stood facing the wall as officers searched the cells. Tyler's heart pounded. When the guard reached him, she kicked over his small pile of papers, letters he'd been writing to his mom and a few notes he'd made comparing the jails he'd been in. The officer, Grant, picked one up and squinted. "What's this?" "Just writing," Tyler said quietly. "Writing?" she repeated, smirking. "You think anyone cares about what happens here?" She tore the paper in half, dropped it on the floor, and moved on. Tyler clenched his fists, but he didn't say a word. That was the rule. Keep quiet, survive another day. When the search ended, the inmates were sent back to their cells. Hours passed. Dinner came and went, lukewarm beans and a stale roll. As night fell, the cell block buzzed with whispers again. Some inmates talked about Lewis. Others argued about a rumor that the feds were coming to inspect Rikers. Tyler didn't believe it, he'd heard that story before. But then, something strange happened. Late that night, a man in a gray uniform, different from the usual guards, appeared on the block with a clipboard. He walked slowly, studying the cells, writing things down. Tyler recognized the badge. It said Federal Oversight Committee. He stopped at Tyler's cell. "How long have you been here?" the man asked quietly. 3 months, Tyler said. The inspector nodded. "How's it been?" Tyler hesitated. He looked down the hall. Officer Grant was watching. Then he looked back at the inspector and whispered, "You should see the infirmary." The inspector wrote something on his clipboard, nodded, and moved on. The next morning, everything changed. The warden himself came down to the block, something that almost never happened. The guards stood straighter, their voices sharper. The word was that the inspectors had found problems, serious ones. Broken cells, overcrowded rooms, unsafe conditions. Tyler watched as they fixed lights, scrubbed floors, and handed out clean bedding. But it all felt fake, like a movie scene. "They only do this when people are watching," Jameson said. "Once those inspectors leave, it'll all go back to the same." And he was right. 3 days later, the inspectors were gone, and the shouting returned. The meals got smaller, the tension heavier. But something inside Tyler had changed. He wasn't just surviving anymore, he was remembering. He started writing again, this time on scraps of toilet paper and old envelopes. He wrote about Lewis, about the fights, about the guards, and the silence that followed every scream. He compared it to every jail he'd seen, how Rikers was worse than them all. Weeks passed. Then one morning, an officer called his name. "King, roll up. You're being transferred." "Transferred?" Tyler asked. "Where to?" "County facility upstate," the officer replied. Tyler packed his things quickly. As he walked through the gate for the last time, he glanced back at the rows of cells. Men stared out silently from behind bars, their faces hard, their eyes hollow. The van ride was long. Hours later, when he arrived at the upstate county jail, he felt the difference instantly. The cells were cleaner, the guards calmer, and the food actually looked like food. The air even smelled different. It wasn't peaceful, but it wasn't Rikers. That night, as he lay on a real bed for the first time in months, Tyler looked at the small window above him. Outside, he could see the faint stars above New York. He whispered to himself, if people only knew what happens there, maybe things would change. He didn't know if Lewis's death would ever make the news. He didn't know if his letters would ever reach anyone. But he knew one thing for sure: he'd survived Rikers Island. And that meant he had a story that needed to be told. The next day, Tyler started his letter again, the first words written carefully across the page. Rikers Island versus other U.S. jails, how conditions compare. He took a deep breath and kept writing, determined to make sure the world would finally listen.